besides just recognizing the problem of under-resourcing, do you think there's maybe like a policy solution to try to combat that and change that?
I do. I think if you had a different administration and different leaders, someone like President Obama, someone like a Hillary Clinton, and I can name a number of Republicans who've been very supportive of development and humanitarian assistance as well. But you need a leader who understands the value of these tools in terms of American influence and impact abroad in ways that directly affect the security of Americans.
So turning away from this kind of broader discussion on military involvement with peace building development and getting back to more personal level, I was wondering if you could talk about the hardest thing that you did during your time at the Pentagon.
Oh boy, that's a tough one. I think the hardest thing for any leader is holding people accountable. And in my time, I had to thank a few people for their service and let them go because they were not able to deliver on the president and the secretary's goals. And they were, and it was too important to allow that to continue. And so needed to, bring in a team that could deliver. And that's probably the hardest thing. Actually, I'll amend that. One thing that was harder, and that was since we had a role in helping the secretary oversee deployments and military operations, I felt very strongly that my staff and I should go to Dover Air Force Base and to be present in receiving the bodies of soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines who had, made the ultimate sacrifice for the policies that we were advising on and writing. And I wanted people to understand at a very visceral level the real potential costs. That this is not a game. It's not just a policy debate. Real Americans are going to put their lives on the line and sometimes lose their lives for the policies that we're writing. And that was going up there, talking to the families, seeing the costs in very real terms. That's probably the hardest thing emotionally. But it was very, very important for us all to do to stay grounded in the reality of what the impacts of some of these policies were.
On that issue that you just mentioned about sometimes having to thank people for their service and let them go, Secretary Gates wrote in his memoir about some of the personnel decisions and personnel changes that you were involved with. And he said that he hoped that would lead to a broader trend of civilian policymakers being able to hold the military accountable, not just for misconduct or legal violations, but also for their performance. How do you think that's played out since your time at the Pentagon?
I don't think it's as consistent or sort of systematized as it should be. I think there is a sense sometimes of careerism in the Pentagon, both on the civilian and military side, not the politicals, but the civil service or the military, which says, well, if I haven't done anything wrong, I should be fine. And sometimes in certain situations, you really have to ask, given the stakes involved, and this was the case in Afghanistan, do we have the best possible person in the right position to lead this, given the importance of the United States, given the human cost and financial costs that we're about to put on the table? Do we have the best person? Not just like, is there a person who is good and didn't do anything wrong, but do we have the best person to deliver this? And that was, I know, a very hard choice for Secretary Gates, but I think switching out commanders was the right decision. And I do think that when the stakes for the nation are high, people should take that risk to make those decisions. One of the things, I do a lot of engagement with officers who are becoming generals or admirals. And one of the things I've said to them is, you spend a career sort of amassing political capital. At some point, you have to flip the switch and say, I'm a leader now. I have influence. I can have impact. how am I going to spend that capital? You can't take it with you. You got to spend it down to zero or maybe even into deficit. But what are the things that matter? What kind of change are you going to try to make? What kind of impact are you going to try to have as a leader?
As China's role grows greater on the global stage, you want to stay up to date on the issues most pressing to China both domestically and internationally. Check out the Just China podcast for in-depth analysis on recent headlines and investigative reports on Chinese matters that affect our globalized world. We are Just China. Find us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you enjoy your podcast listening.
In the intro of our podcast, we have a quote by President Eisenhower in his farewell address when he talks about our need to guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. And in America, there's a spectrum of people who think, on the one hand, that the military is too big and it's this war machine. But on the other hand, we also need American companies who are effective at delivering technology and platforms so the military can properly carry out its missions. I'm curious how you think citizens should evaluate whether the military-industrial complex has grown too large and acquired that unwarranted influence.
I think one of the things that a metric you can use to evaluate this is whether when DoD tries to make a big change of direction, as we are trying to do right now, does the Congress allow it to make the hard choices that would divest from legacy systems that have a lot of people invested in their success and move towards new capabilities that may not have those well-developed constituencies? So let me give it a little more, be more specific. We're in a period where we are shifting to have to worry about the potential for great power conflict, certainly competition, and there has to be a big emphasis on deterrence. And deterring a rising China, deterring a resurgent Russia means that we have to really invest in a new kind of warfare, and we have to invest in a new set of technologies and capabilities, whether it's quantum computing or artificial intelligence, better cybersecurity, new forms of electronic warfare, directed energy. I mean, you can go on and on down the list. But the force that we've sort of honed and perfected for counterterrorism and counterinsurgency over the last nearly 2 decades is not the force we need to deter conflict with China and Russia. So we need industry as partners in making that shift. And some of the big traditional defense contractors are trying to make that shift, but a lot of this technology is going to come from the commercial sector and from smaller, sometimes even startup companies. And so the name of the game is, how do you enable the Department of Defense to really access that cutting edge commercial technology and adapt it to military purposes and move forward? And there are lots of different ways to do that. That's one of the things that WestExec is trying to help with. How do you help these smaller cutting edge technology firms actually navigate the DoD and national security space? So I don't think we should look at industry as, the enemy or just, sort of feeding at the trough of the DoD budget. Yes, there are times when industry influences Congress to make bad decisions, but they're also a critical partner in getting the capabilities that will enable us to actually deter and, if necessary, prevail in a future conflict.
On that topic of investment in emerging technologies and startups, we read an article 2 years ago or so about a lot of Chinese companies' efforts to sort of get involved and invest in American defense startups, emerging technology. And then just a couple of days ago, there was an initiative announced by the DoD, this like trusted capital marketplace. Is that right? Trusted capital marketplace, kind of geared towards combating some of that. Do you think that there is enough attention being paid to that sort of economic realm in defense policy?
I think the attention is just now starting to really become properly focused. It turns out there is a lot of Chinese money in our supply chain, both in the defense realm and in the commercial technology realm. I think you have to draw distinctions here. Some of that money is passive investment, meaning you have a Chinese investor, they want a good return on investment. The startup world seems like a good place to go, but they have no board seat, they have no decision rights, they have no access to non-public intellectual property. That kind of investment is fine. It's money in the bloodstream of Silicon Valley or Route 128 or whatever. The issue is when they get a seat at the table for decision making, when they have access to non-public IP, because then the worry is that intellectual property can be transferred in some way. And in China, there's this doctrine of civil-military fusion, which means that any interesting commercial advances in technology that have a military application must be shared with the PLA, the Chinese military. And so that is of concern. So I think the DoD and others are appropriately concerned. I think we have to kind of carefully work through the new laws governing foreign investment, this trusted kind of partner approach, and so forth. So I do think this is an important area that we need to go down this path.
So you mentioned WestExec for a moment and the work you're doing with WestExec, trying to help industries navigate the military complex and trying to build technologies and platforms to help the military. At the same time, there's been a little bit of criticism against WestExec and other kinds of companies for being part of this revolving door effect, where you have officials from the Pentagon now going out to work in consulting and advisory, which in turn just help other industries and contractors get more contracts and jobs from the DoD.
I do think it's something we have to keep an eye on, but I also think that it comes in different flavors, and some of them are acceptable and some of them are not. I mean, what we're doing is, we hear an urgent need from the Department of Defense, and they don't know how to find the technology in the commercial sector. We try to be technology scouts and find the companies that are most able to get that capability to the warfighter quickly. And all we do is make the match, and then we're done. We are not lobbying, we're not influencing, we're not, trying to make sure that somebody does a contract. We're just trying to match make so that, if we ever encounter, a great power adversary, the folks we've put in harm's way have the best equipment and the best technology that our whole country has to offer. So that, I think, is a positive. If having the experience inside the department enables us to help be that matchmaker outside more effectively, I think that's a good thing. I do think the department and all administrations have been very careful. They have ethics rules. There are periods for 2 years where I could not talk to my former colleagues. I still can't work on specific items that I worked on when I was in government. I have to recuse myself. So it's something to be very carefully monitored and managed. But I actually think the experience and the relationships can be leveraged for the good of the country rather than just for, people pursuing personal gain.
So there's a difference between just trying to make a genuine connection for a DoD need versus just trying to make money off the DoD, but still underlying all of that, we have a system of checks and balances in place to make sure people are doing things appropriately.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's all kinds of things you have to disclose, and that's appropriate. I mean, I think we want to make sure that people are not using their connections just for personal gain.
So after the 2016 election, it was pretty widely reported that Secretary Mattis had asked you to serve as his deputy. And you've already talked in other interviews and stuff about why you didn't end up taking that role. We were kind of wondering if you could talk about that issue just more broadly, though, for civilian policymakers and public servants who want to serve in government but aren't sure whether they can do it under like a certain administration. Like, what kind of framework do future public servants need to be able to think about that decision that you had to make in 2016?
Well, I felt a tremendous sense of duty, that if asked to serve, the propensity is always to say yes.